Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome. I'm very impressed at those of you who've made it out through the cold and the damp to be here tonight. Well done indeed. And I know what's drawn you, a chance to catch up with the latest edition of the Bible story. So without further ado, I just did want to say a warm welcome to those of you joining us online as well. It's really super to have you with us. And I am very glad to welcome Barbara, who's going to take us into session 5.
Session 5, ladies and gentlemen, is entitled On from Sinai for 40 Years. So we've got a lot of ground to cover. But to recap on last time we met, it was so important. Session 4 was, the big session of this term that we're doing, because we managed to do almost the impossible, considering all 4 of the massive platforms which support the foundation events, not only for the Jewish faith, but also for Christianity and also for Islam. What are they? Well, namely the Passover, the first, then the Exodus, then the establishing of the covenant, and fourthly, the giving of the law. Now, I'm sure you've heard of all those things in your Sunday school classes and so on, but I managed to put them all together because that's the foundation block of everything that's going to come from now on. Well, the giving of Yahweh's law developed into the Torah, which Jews will talk about. And when they talk about the Torah, they talk about the 5 books of Moses, all on one big scroll. And they use that in their synagogue services each time they meet. Well, in doing so, we kept the stories as simple as possible. But throughout the series from now on, we should be hearing in story form how the Jews have worked out all the implications of these 4 crucial events, all through their history and on into the present. Well, Mount Sinai was a mountaintop experience. You've seen this picture before. A mountain experience par excellence. They stayed in that area for quite a long time, during which time Moses disappeared right up into the cloud at the top of the mountain to commune with Yahweh. He'd finished and accomplished his first mission very successfully and brought Yahweh's people out of Egypt to the mountain to meet him. And the people also wanted to linger near their powerful God and worship him while they were also full of enthusiasm for him. They had a problem, however. How could they worship an invisible God? They couldn't work out how. An invisible God who was up there somewhere on the mountain and beyond in the cloud. And they made their first mistake. They needed something tangible and visible like everybody else to represent the presence of their God Yahweh, so they could have another sacrificial meal and celebration with him. They appealed to Aaron, Moses' brother, the first of their priestly line. Now, most religions have a group of priests who take responsibility for sacrificial worship. And we read in Exodus 32 that Aaron masterminded the golden calf incident for the people. I expect you've heard this story, but the people just said, Moses has gone for a long time, we don't even know if he's coming back. What can we do? We want to worship this God. Help us. And the only way Aaron could help them was to give them something that they would recognize as a sort of God like everybody else had, and get on with the sacrifice and the festivities. Well, they offered all their gold rings and bracelets and charms and everything else, and he ground down the gold, made a golden calf. I rather like that picture, do you? He made the golden calf. Well, we can talk about the practicalities of smelting gold in the wilderness, creating such a statue, and we can surmise that Aaron would have thought of calf representation because that was a common one in those days for a god. Or we can surmise that the later golden calves that we shall hear about next year, in the years after the death of King Solomon, they would have been written back into the Sinai narratives. Or we can ponder on the future tensions between priests of Jerusalem and the prophets of the north. Or we can just enjoy the dramatic story as it has been finally edited. Let's do that. Well, the joyful, worshipful festivities were in full swing when suddenly and totally unexpectedly Moses reappeared, coming down from the holy mountain, carrying the laws of Yahweh inscribed on 2 tablets of stone. He heard the revelry going on and wondered what on earth was going on and was horrified by what he saw. His anger was absolutely intense. In his anger, he smashed the 2 stone tablets he had brought from the mountain. He smashed them on the ground. He threw the calf image into the banqueting fire and melted it before grinding the coal again and scattering it over some water and making the people drink it. Then his anger turned on Aaron, who could only sort of mutter, "It wasn't my fault. They made me do it." And Moses was even more furious when he realized how undisciplined the people had become in his absence, and he imposed a punishment upon them. But before he returned to the mountain to seek God's mercy, Moses realized the necessity of giving the people an image of something, an image-less focus, that they could see every day and think of Yahweh. He set up a special tent called the Tent of Meeting. The Tent of Meeting. He fenced it around to create a space that would keep the people at a holy distance, and the people could then see Moses when he went to meet Yahweh there. And when the cloud came on the tent, everybody knew that Yahweh was there with Moses. Well, when all was running smoothly again, Moses returned to Sinai and climbed the mountain again to beg for Yahweh's mercy for the people. Eventually he came back radiant again and with 2 more stones inscribed with Yahweh's law. I can't help wondering what language that was in. I just don't know. The language of Midian, the language of Egypt, or what? I don't know. There certainly wasn't any Hebrew in existence by this time. So we're left to wonder. But he placed them in a special box, attached to 2 long poles, and with a sort of empty seat on the top. The empty seat, of course, was for the invisible Yahweh to sit and pronounce whatever judgments he chose. All this then in the Ark of the Covenant, and he placed that in the tent. Inside it were the stones from Mount Sinai. Thus the people could be aware of it in the middle of their encampment, know that Yahweh and the stones of the holy mountain could be carried and would go with them in all their travels. And that sort of brings us back to Abraham, doesn't it? Travelling with his family God in the form of a teraph, that empty pot with holes for his eyes and mouth. Well, for the future, theologically, this was very important. It liberated the thought of Yahweh from being tied down to any one geographical place. And it just freed him. They could take him anywhere and he would go with them anywhere. Well, the book of Exodus goes on and on and on and ends with 6 chapters of description. A description of all the lavish furnishings and adornments made and placed in this simple desert tent, together with all the elaborate clothing to be worn by the high priest and his attendants, all of which were not in the simple tent, but hundreds of years later were actually in the temple at Jerusalem in the peak of its glory about 200 BCE. And that's just when the Old Testament, as we know it, was receiving its final editing. So we go straight over that and back to our story, which doesn't continue in the book of Leviticus, because that's all law. Leviticus, it's all law that's been added in, and the first 10 chapters of Numbers. We pick the story up then at verse 11 in chapter 10 of the book of Numbers. But the time had come for the tribes to break camp at Sinai and move on to a more fertile area. The tent of meeting was packed up too. The small liturgy came into being, one part to be said when the ark set out, and I quote, "Arise, O Yahweh, let your enemies be scattered and your foes scattered before you." And another, when it came to rest again, "Return, O Yahweh, of the 10,000 thousands of Israel." Before they left, Moses persuaded his brother-in-law Hobab to join them, as his knowledge of the unknown area ahead would be of great help. And in return, he would enjoy the same good fortune as the Israelites when they reached the promised land of milk and honey. Then they all set out for a continuing hard future. They stayed in the wilderness because Egypt was in control of their promised land of Canaan. So they stayed where they were. Eventually they were curious, and they sent some spies ahead to have a look at this promised land of milk and honey. The spies travelled northwards and came to Hebron. They liked what they saw. They cut a branch of grapes to take back with them. But when they arrived back, there was little enthusiasm among the people, many of whom were still of that sort of slave mentality that hadn't much initiative of their own. And they were certainly not very impressed when they heard reports of the many strong people living in large fortified towns, including the Amalekites, whom they had fought earlier. They wouldn't listen to Caleb or anyone else who wanted them to go on straight away. Some of the people even wanted to go back to Egypt. And it is possible that a group of them did go back to Egypt to the good foods and fruits that they remembered there. Well, they left. And it became obvious that the people who have once been slaves could never become an aggressive fighting force again. And that meant a long wait. Wait until all the leaders and most of the original travellers had died a natural death. Well, it took years. Only then, when the next generation was growing up, hardened by the only desert life they had known, then they would be ready to fight anyone to get what they wanted. The big question remained, would these travellers meld together into a cohesive people, united in loyalty to Yahweh? Or would they become a random group of smaller tribes, having little to do with each other? And it was during this time that many quarrels broke out, even between Moses and Aaron and Miriam. Only time would tell. They settled at a big oasis, Kadesh Barnea. And if you ever travel in that area, this is probably the oasis you'll visit. It's to the south of Canaan, but in the territory in those days ruled by the king of Edom. It had 3 springs in the area, and they stayed for many years. And during that time, Miriam died. Throughout this time, while Yahweh's people were living in obscurity, the coastal plain of Canaan had been very busy. Let's look at the map. You can see the yellow dominating the Egyptian power, meeting halfway down the coast from the Hittite power, pictured in red. These 2 empires had been waging war and alternately gaining control over the area. But in 1295, a verifiable date in history, a battle took place. The earliest known organised battle. And it happened where those 2 colours meet, where the red meets the yellow, at a place called Kadesh. It's in Syria and just south of Damascus. Have I got that? No, just north of Damascus. The Battle of Kadesh. It took place near the river Orontes, between King Muwatalli of the Hittites and Pharaoh Ramesses II of Egypt. It was fought long and hard. There's all Ramesses' troops rushing into battle. It was a very hard battle, and there were many casualties on both sides. That's from a carving in the Ramesseum in Egypt. You can just vaguely see all the horses lying dead and all the people lying dead. It really was a battle with a lot of carnage. So much so that although it was a huge battle and a very important battle, neither side won. And neither side ever recovered. They really did destroy each other's strength. The war lingered on, though, for another 5 years, until it was finalised with a peace treaty. And there it is. There are 2 versions of this, one in Istanbul, that of the Hittites, and the other in Egypt. So it's an absolutely valid piece of history. It was finalised with this peace treaty and a mutual exchange of brides. So the Pharaoh got a Hittite bride and the Hittites got an Egyptian bride, and that sort of sealed the treaty. But all this devastation left Canaan absolutely open to invasion. Neither of these powers could stop them. Both these powers had claimed the victory, of course, for the Battle of Kadesh, but they never really functioned properly again. It left Canaan open to invasion, with very little of any opposition, and all sorts of new people began to arrive. From Mesopotamia in the north, the Philistines from the west, and guess who from the south? But not yet. The time did come for the young, strong, and fiercely independent Israelite tribespeople to decide to make a move. Moses first requested permission from the king of Edom to move through his territory along the king's highway. Have you ever been along there? It still exists, and it is the route people follow today. And there it is. A winding road through the desert, and it starts at Damascus in Syria and travels southwards through the hills and the valleys, right down to the Gulf of Aqaba. Really is a very important road. But it doesn't look very inviting from this view. Moses offered, or asked the king of Edom if they could travel along this road without straying either to right or left. In other words, not to do any damage to the land of Edom. But permission was refused. It is such a well-trodden route from Damascus to the Red Sea port of Aqaba that many, many people travel along it. But the Israelites had to travel all around the outside of Edom's territory instead. And during this time, Aaron died on a mountaintop and was succeeded by his son, the priest Eleazar. Let's look at the map for a moment. I hope you can see it. Doesn't look very clear on mine, but in the middle, you've got the River Jordan going from north to south, finishing at the Dead Sea. On the western side, which is to the left of the map, you've got the green, fertile plain of Canaan and Syria. On the right-hand side, or the eastern side of the Dead Sea, you have all these little kingdoms, Edom in the south, Moab in the middle, and the Ammonites to the north. Now Moses had to lead the Israelites right round the outside of Edom, bypassing Moab, till they got to the king of Ammon. Where have we got to? King of Ammon also refused permission, but they were all beginning to be rather afraid of this marauding, fierce force coming from the south. But this time they fought. They fought and they won. But do remember, these little kingdoms were very small. But each skirmish really did increase their confidence. The stories are good, and particularly this next one. Balak, king of Moab, on the eastern side of the Dead Sea, was next in line, and so scared of the future that in his fear he sent messengers to a well-known diviner who could utter a curse or a blessing or a fee. Do you remember the blessings and the curse in the time of Isaac and Esau and Jacob? Same sort of idea. If a special person could utter a curse or a blessing, then it was like a fortune teller almost forcing that to happen. A diviner, they were called. So King Balak sent for a diviner. This one was called Balaam, who lived near the Euphrates in Mesopotamia. Let's get rid of this. He asked him to come and lay a curse on, and I quote, on the people who have come from Egypt and spread over the face of the earth. And Balaam was offered a very handsome fee if he would come, but he refused. Then King Balak in Moab sent a message, refused to take no for an answer, and sent an even bigger deputation of much more important people with offers of expense no object. And this time, Balaam hesitated. Next morning, he agreed. He had had some reservations, but he did agree to go with them. So he saddled his donkey, or was it an ass, and set off with the delegation back to Moab. It wasn't long, however, before his donkey turned aside from the road into a field, having been told, so we are told, having seen the angel of Yahweh with a sword in his hand. But Balaam struck the donkey and tried to get it to go on. But again, the donkey refused. Balaam insisted. This time, the donkey scraped his foot against the vineyard wall. And again, it had a second beating. And the third time, the donkey, or was it an ass, just sat down under Balaam. And I cannot resist this picture. Painted by Rembrandt. Can you see the donkey or the ass sitting on the ground? There's Balaam on top, nearly falling off, with his sword ready to strike the ass. And the angel with his stave on the trying to stop Balaam from acting. Well, the donkey spoke. A donkey spoke in protest, asking why Balaam had struck him. Balaam replied that the donkey had made him look a fool in the eyes of the Moabite delegation, and if only he had a sword on him, he would have killed the donkey. But the donkey had the last word. Am I not your donkey, which you have ridden all your life to this day? Have I been in the habit of treating you this way? Balaam said, no, and suddenly saw, with the help of Yahweh's angel, that a greater power than any of his donkey, that of his donkey, had intervened on his journey. The power, Yahweh of course, told him to continue his journey, but under Yahweh's direction. And eventually they arrived back in Moab. And King Balak chastised him for taking such a long time, but then agreed to hear what he would say. The next day, King Balak took Balaam to a high promontory from which they could see some of the Israelites. Balaam ordered 7 altars to be prepared for a huge sacrificial event. And then, leaving King Balak beside his offerings, Balaam went off alone to commune with Yahweh within himself. And he returned with his answer in an ancient poem. And you can find it in Numbers chapter 13, verse 10. And possibly it's another contemporary song. This is it. How can I curse whom God does not curse? How can I damn whom Yahweh does not damn? For from the rocks I see them, from the rocks I observe them. Behold, a people living apart, not counting themselves among the nations. But who can count the dust of Jacob or number the mass of Israel? So this obviously was a very frightening situation. And after several more attempts, Balak gave up. He dismissed Balaam and wouldn't pay him a penny. Well, during this time, Israel, now these tribes moving together, had infiltrated Moab. And a foretaste of the future appeared. Some of the hardy desert men began to be attracted to the local Moabite women and their way of life, which revolved around the seasons and the luscious crops. It all looked so attractively good. But in joining them, they found themselves involved in the worship of the Moabite fertility gods. There was condemnation from Moses, and the people were punished. We're told they were stamped out in a plague. And I leave you to surmise what sort of plague it might have been to those desert men. More time passed. Moses now was growing very old indeed. And the day came when he appointed Joshua to be his successor. At that point, the book of Numbers switches off. And we don't pick it up until the end of it has been tacked onto the book of Deuteronomy. So we'll jump into the end of Deuteronomy. It describes that when the Israelites had approached the northern end of the Dead Sea, but still in Moses had climbed Mount Nebo. They really were still are massive mountains in that area. And Moses climbed Mount Nebo and saw for the first and the last time the view over the promised land. Quite a sight. He saw for the first and last time the land of milk and honey promised by Yahweh to his people, whom he, Moses, had led out of Egypt to claim. I wonder if he felt like this man. What a view. But it was there that he died. And that's what you will see if you go to stand on that promontory now. He was buried in an unknown location, somewhere in the valley below. But his well-deserved tribute makes a fitting end, not only to his story, but also placed where it now is, to the whole Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses. And it reads, "Never since has there arisen a prophet in Israel like Moses, whom Yahweh knew face to face. He was unequaled for all the signs and wonders that Yahweh sent him to perform in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh and all his servants and his entire land, and for all the mighty deeds and the terrifying displays of power that Moses performed in the sight of all Israel." Well, who could possibly disagree with all that? Now, we shall leave out the book of Deuteronomy until later in the course when it appears in its own story. Well, next time we shall go to the story of Joshua, when the Israelites went into the land of promise. And we shall finish with that great triumph just before we break for Christmas. So come again in 2 weeks' time on the 19th of December, and we'll conquer Canaan with Joshua. Thank you for coming this afternoon.